Good morning. You ever hear about, does anybody here know a lot about gangs? All right, that's good. Okay. All right, so one of the things I've heard about gangs, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's very hard to get out of a gang. Right? If you're in a gang, it can be really tough to get out. And sometimes it's just you don't get out. No, you're a part of this group. You want out, too bad, tough. The only way you get out is when you die. Other times, a gang will be more gracious, and they'll let you get out. They'll beat you out of the gang. You know, or they'll have some kind of, I guess it wouldn't be an initiation process, some kind of extasiation. What? All right, so there you go. So it's not easy to get out of a gang. Prison ministry, you go to prison, one of the things that you don't really ask guys in prison, it's tempting. You go and you work with guys and you get to know some guys, and your heart starts to go out to them because you know they seem like they're doing their penance and they're repentant, but you don't ask how much longer do you have in here or when are you getting out. You don't like to talk about that because sometimes in prison, let's say I've got 2 weeks left and we're all inmates together. If you've got 2 years left or 20 years left and you know that I'm close to getting out, then you don't like me because I'm close to freedom. And so you might do a couple of different things. You might just purposely pick a fight with me so then we both get in trouble and maybe I'll have to say, or you want me to do something you want me to kill somebody in there or hurt somebody in there. People are gonna start instigating. So when people get close to when they're getting out, a lot of times they just put their head down and they're quiet. They don't say a thing to anybody. And actually the prison system knows about this, so sometimes when guys are getting close, they'll shift people around. You know, so a lot of times you wouldn't expect that the new inmate is just gonna be there for a little bit of time. So it actually can be really hard to get out of prison. Now, I try not to make it a habit of talking about rated R movies from the pulpit, but probably a lot of us have seen The Shawshank Redemption, yeah, kind of a classic prison movie. And there you've got a guy that has gotten out of prison, right? One of the guys has gotten out of prison. He's working at a grocery store, and you see that he can't handle freedom. So sometimes getting our freedom can be difficult. Making some of those transitions. Getting out of slavery can be difficult, okay? If you could imagine, if we can kind of jump and put ourselves in each of these situations, imagine that we were all slaves. We're all slaves and we all are in different locations doing different things, and it's not a good situation. It's a rough culture we live in and society, and slavery is an ugly, dirty, nasty thing, and we're abused and we're tormented. And is that easy to get out of? Well, yeah, in an emotional way, freedom seems like it's very desirable, right? But what do? When you're a slave, do you have any possessions? Do you have any money? You know, most likely in our situation that I'm displaying here, we wouldn't. So you run away and you can get away, and you can find, and you get to a place in this world where you can actually have your freedom. And what do you have? The clothes on your back. And so even getting out of slavery, it's a desirable thing. We want freedom. We want to have that. But it's hard to get it, because then even when you're there and you're free, you have nothing. And how can you get something? And let's say that when we became slaves, we were branded. So now I try to go get a job, but I've got a mark. And everybody knows this guy is a slave. I'm not going to give him a job because he's a slave. So even though I'm free, there's aspects of that slavery that still have a hold of me, right? There's lingering effects. And And a literal physical slavery is not the only thing that can relate to that. Think of addictions. Somebody could be addicted to a drug. Somebody could be addicted to alcohol. And they could strongly desire in their heart and mind to be free of that addiction. And they could even have a time of sobriety. But then some stressful thing in life comes up, and their brain still triggers, and their brain still says, you want comfort? Here it is, back in that addiction. And so you're free of it, you kicked the habit, but there's still that draw that's there. And slavery to addiction is very hard to gain a freedom from. There is a comfort level. Or in an immediate sense, there are symptoms of withdrawal. So, maybe you're a smoker, and I'm going to quit smoking. Day one, hour one, I don't know, how, depending on how much nicotine your body is used to. And you start shaking, and you start sweating. And so there is an impulse in you that as human beings, one of our greatest desires is physical comfort. So you're shaking and you're sweating, and what do you want? How can I get this to go away? With a cigarette. I want freedom from these things, but right now, I just need a smoke to calm myself, to make this shaking go away. And so we see the same thing, abusive relationships. It's hard from the outside, sometimes it's hard to see an abuse. Why is that person, why is she still with him? Why is she still with him? And she may have even gotten out of the abusive relationship. Maybe you're the heroic friend, and you go talk to that abusive man, and you say, my girlfriend, she's not going to take this anymore from you. She's getting out, and we know who you are, and we know what you're about, and she's not going to put up with it anymore. And you've done this great deed for your friend. But what happens? Your friend comes to you a week later and yells at you. Why did you talk to him that way? You only made things worse for me. And you're confused because you were being the good friend. You were helping them out of their slavery. You were helping them out of this terrible situation. And you thought they wanted out of it. When they were crying at your house and on your shoulder, they said, I can't be with him anymore. I need to get out of this situation. And you helped with that. And now they're turning on you. Because it's hard to get out of slavery. Redemption is what we want. Freedom is what we want. But when we start walking down that road, it gets hard. It's not easy. There's prices to pay. And so we have to admit some of these truths in all of life. And from a Christian point of view, first is we have to struggle with our human desire, our fleshly desire for comfort. Because that desire for comfort often overrides our desire for freedom and for truth and for righteousness. Because we start going down the right path, and it gets uncomfortable, and it gets hard, and that little voice kicks in and says, you know what? It was easier. Even in all of the pain and strife addiction, there's just something that says, it was just easier when we were doing that, when we were with them, when we were over there, when we were slaves to this thing or to that place. So we need to confront that issue of comfort. And then secondly, and we get this more, thank God, with the wisdom that we have as Christians, and from having a Christian and a biblical view of the world, it gives us a notch up on the rest of the world, is that we understand that there is an enemy that is against us. That it's not just the forces of the world, it's not just that there's this pull of addiction, it's that there is an enemy who is actively seeking to destroy us. That is luring you back into that slavery. Let's turn our Bibles to Exodus chapter 5. We've been following the nation of Israel as they have been slaves and have been enslaved by Egypt. And they have cried out to God Almighty. And God has heard their cries. And God has remembered his covenant. And God has chosen Moses and sent Moses to go and free his people from Egypt. And so we've seen that there's a lot of suffering. Last week we saw that one thing that at least they had going for them in all of their suffering is that they were all suffering. And so they could have some kind of comfort in that. We have to give Israel a lot of credit because even after over 400 years, they still had trust in God. It was still God that they cried out to. And they suffered with one another. But let's see how things unfold here in Exodus chapter 5. It says, afterwards, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so that they may hold a festival to me in the desert. Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. Then they said, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now let us take a 3-day journey into the desert to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, or he may strike us with plagues or with the sword. But the king of Egypt said, Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to your work. Then Pharaoh said, look, the people of the land are now numerous, and you are stopping them from working. So you can see kind of what's going on here is the Pharaoh is starting to get really upset. And he's offended because in Egypt, like in many pagan nations, the leader, the king, he was God or a god that people would serve. And so here you're coming to me and you're talking to me about some other god. I don't know this other god that you're talking about. And to me, what it sounds like is you're just coming up with excuses because your people are tired and lazy and don't want to work for me anymore. Well, tell you what, all you're doing is keeping them from their work, and that's not going to be good. So you just better leave me alone. Pick up in verse 6. That same day, Pharaoh gave this order to the slave drivers and foremen in charge of the people. You are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They are lazy. That is why they are crying out, let us go make sacrifices to our God. Make the work harder for the men so that they will keep working and pay no attention to lies. Then the slave drivers and the foremen went out and said to the people, this is what Pharaoh says. I will not give you any more straw. Go and get your own straw wherever you can find it, but your work will not be reduced at all. So the people scattered all over Egypt to gather stubble to use for straw. The slave drivers kept pressing them, saying, complete the work required of you for each day, just as when you had straw. The Israelite foremen appointed by Pharaoh's slave drivers were beaten and were asked, why didn't you meet your quota of bricks yesterday or today as before? Then the Israelite foreman went and appealed to Pharaoh, why have you treated your servants this way? Your servants are given no straw, yet are told, make bricks. Your servants are being beaten, but the fault is with your own people. Pharaoh said, lazy. That's what you are, lazy. That is why you keep saying, let us go and sacrifice to the Lord. Now get to work. You will not be given any straw, yet you must produce your full quota of bricks. The Israelite foremen realized they were in trouble when they were told, you are not to reduce the number of bricks required for each day. When they left Pharaoh, they found Moses and Aaron waiting to meet them. And they said, may the Lord look upon and judge you. You have made us a stench to Pharaoh and his officials, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. So we can see that clearly the Israelites had an enemy. They had one who was against them, who was in opposition to them. The king of Egypt, right? The Pharaoh of Egypt was against them. And you can see that in any glimpse or hope of not even total freedom, even just a couple of days off, he comes down hard on them. And he tries to establish a couple things. He wants to crush their hope, and he wants to put their heads down. Because in his world and in his view is, if I give them a day or two off now, they're going to want a day or two off later. You know, if I bend now, they're going to think I'm bendable, and that maybe one day I'll break. And so the Pharaoh has this kind of, I'm not going to show any weaknesses policy. And I'm just going to view you as a bunch of lazy people. And I'm going to tell you, you keep asking for these things, you keep whining and crying about these things. Every time you do, I'm going to make the work harder and harder for you. And so you know what's going to happen is, you're not going to be able to whine, because you're going to start concerning yourself with meeting that quota. Well, it seems like Pharaoh was pretty successful. He crushed their hope. He got them to put their heads down. By the end of the chapter, he's got the people more concerned about pleasing Pharaoh. Right? They come to Moses and Aaron and they say, they're upset, and they say, you made us a stench to Pharaoh and his officials. They're concerned about how they look in Pharaoh's eyes. Now, some of that seems justifiable, right? Because they're the ones getting beaten. They're the ones that are having to endure this. They place the blame on the ones that were sent to deliver them. Moses and Aaron, just not too long ago, were the ones that were bringing hope. They brought the Israelite officials together, and they said, God's going to deliver you from Egypt. And Moses even had all these signs, right? He could put his hand in his coat and take it out, and it would be leprous. Put it back and take it out, it would be healed. He would take his staff and throw it on the ground, it would turn into a snake. Grab that snake, and it would turn back into his staff. And this was to prove to the people he was, in fact, a messenger from God. And there was a hope that was there. There was a courage that was there that had not been in Israel for quite some time. And Moses and Aaron were going to be their saviors. They were going to be the ones that were going to lead them out of Egypt. And now, when things got tough, what did they do? They go to their saviors, they go to their deliverers, and they say, may God judge you because you made things tough for us. So what Pharaoh was doing was work. People become more concerned about their work, more concerned about blaming their deliverers, more concerned about their own physical comfort. So they become distracted, and they're not thinking about deliverance anymore. Right now they're thinking about making their quota. And in turn, Moses turns around in verse 22. Moses returned to the Lord and said, O Lord, why have you brought trouble upon this people? Is that why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble upon this people, and you have not rescued your people at all. So they go to Moses with issues, and Moses goes to God. What's going on here? The burning bush, you said you were going to send me to deliver these people from Egypt. And now every time I talk to Pharaoh, things just get worse. What's going on here? So we've gone from having hope and trust in God to having a renewed spirit and courage. We're finally getting out of slavery. We're excited about our redemption. We're excited about our freedom, to may God judge you. Questioning God. God, what are we doing here? What's going on? What are you doing? They're going to save these people. They're going to rescue these people. You're just making it harder on them. You're just bringing trouble on them. And that picture right there is a snapshot of our slavery, our addictions, our messed up relationships, all those things that we can't pull out of. And we try to pull out. And once we start down that road, and once we start going that route, things often get harder before they get easier. And they get harder, and then there's that draw to just go back. You know what? God, I don't know what you're doing. I made the commitment that I was going to give this thing up, and you were supposed to make that easy. You were supposed to rescue me from it. And it seems like you're just bringing trouble on me. So forget that and forget you. I'm just going to go back and do things that they were. They were bad, but at least they weren't this bad. And that is the crossroads that we come to. Pain and hope smashed together. It's unbearable. So what do? We have to either choose to return to what was comforting us before, which is usually something absurd and obscene like slavery. And it seems ridiculous, but Israel goes on to say this more. Later on, after they've been free, after they're actually out of Egypt, but before they get to the promised land, a number of times they say, it would be better for us to be back as slaves in Egypt. Now, we know that's ridiculous talk, but we think the same things in our lives sometimes, or the way we act. So somehow, what is detestable and what we're trying to escape from becomes the very thing that we long for and that we desire. Somehow it becomes a comfort in our brains. So when we come to that crossroads, when things really start to get difficult, we have to choose. Are we going to go back to what's comfortable, or are we going to push on through the pain? Because those people would never get to the promised land if they don't eventually push through the pain, if they don't endure it, if they don't work through it. They could throw their hands up. They could say, Moses, we're not going, we're not following you, and they could stay in Egypt. And then they would never, ever make it to the promised land. We have those same choices. First, I'm going to read a couple of scriptures here. 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 6 through 10. So how do we act when we kind of come to these situations, whether it be the overall scheme of things and your salvation that needs to be worked out? If it's your salvation that we're talking about, that you were saved and you had a glorious moment of amazing grace, things are going to get tough. Your old friends, your old habits, the old ways of life are going to come calling. So whether it be in the grand scheme of things in your salvation, or whether it be in one of those specific things, one of those specific habits that you're trying to kick, one of those specific addictions, one of those specific relationships you need to get out of. Whatever it may be, we're going to have these times where we hit these crossroads and we need to decide, can I push through this pain, or will I choose to return to what might be comfortable in my mind? In 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 6 through 10, we get a glimpse of this idea of the enemy and some of what might be able to help us. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. So that kind of bridges into last week. When we're struggling, we need to cry out to God. Cast your anxiety on him, he cares for you. Be self-controlled and alert. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking for someone to devour. Okay, so that is our enemy. Peter makes no bones about it. He doesn't say the lion's roaming around, looking for someone to kiss with his hairy whiskered tongue, right? Devour. Devour. Satan wants to devour you. Okay? Let's not be mistaken. He's not a nice enemy. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that your brothers throughout the world are undergoing the same kind of sufferings. So again, one thing that we can hold on to when we hit those crossroads, when we get to that place of pain, is to know that you are not alone. So often we think, I'm alone. So you can go to somebody else and get some comfort and get some encouragement and get some guidance. And all the while, putting your faith in God. Why? Verse 10. And the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered a little while, will himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast. God never says you won't have to suffer. Is there anything you can do to earn salvation? No. But when did the Israelites do anything to earn freedom from Egypt? No. God chose them as his people. And he came to them, he heard their cries, he said, I love you, I remember you, I'm going to rescue you. But there is going to be pain in the process. There's going to be some hardships. There's going to be some suffering. But what Peter tells us is, after you suffer for a little while, God is going to restore you. God is going to make you strong. He's going to make you firm and steadfast. So we need to always hold on to the hope, even when things get dark, even when things get dim. This is one of the neatest in Habakkuk, chapter 3, at the end of the book here. Some of you may have heard of the Christian book Hind's Feet and Hind's Places. So that title comes from these scriptures here at the end of Habakkuk. And just imagine if we could all adopt the same resolve that this prophet adopted, that in the things that he writes here at the end of this chapter, that we would be able to, and this is kind of the challenge, I guess, of the week, that you'd be able to read through this, and what you read, you'd be able to agree with, that you could amen it and say, yes, what that guy said, that's how I feel too. This is what he says in chapter 3, verses 17 through 19. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen, and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to go on the heights. So, could that be who we are? That even when there seems to be no hope, when there's no good things that are around us, there's no fruit on the vine, there's no food in the field, that even then, we'd be able to honestly say, I rejoice in God. Even when it seems like there's nothing there for us. Even when we're in pain and suffering. Even when the taskmaster puts on more work and expects us to get the same amount done. That we would say, we rejoice in God. I want to finish with Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12 is pretty amazing. There's just I had one of those little aha moments. In this, but Hebrews chapter 12, just verses 1 and 2, it says, therefore, or going on actually through 4, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of God, of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. So kind of a neat or kind of a challenging thing is keep your eyes on Jesus, and when you're suffering and when you're struggling and when you're going through the fire, remember him. And here's the thing is, our suffering and our struggling is a part of our redemption. It's a part of the journey to freedom. It's a part of the journey to the promised land. Is if we want that, if we really want that promised land, if we really want heaven, there's a guarantee that there's going to be some suffering on the road. You know, the thing about Jesus is Jesus suffered, but Jesus didn't suffer to be redeemed. Jesus suffered so he could be the Redeemer. And that is the most incredible thing about Jesus Christ, is he didn't have to suffer. He never had to leave his Father's side. He could have stayed up there. He submitted to the Father's will, and he became a man. That, in itself, was humbling enough for him. So not only did he become a man, but he became a man who was widely rejected by his own people, who though some honored him and some wanted him to make him king, a lot of that was selfish motives, because he can turn water into wine and produced lots of bread and fish when we were hungry. Let's make him king. And so he had to struggle with that, with a lot of the people that actually liked him didn't get his message. And then the other people were scared of him and threatened by him. And they killed him. And so Jesus went through a lot of pain and a lot of suffering, because they didn't just kill him. They didn't just put a bullet in his head. They tortured him. They beat him. They made a crown of thorns, and they pressed it in on his head and made him wear it. And here he is, the Son of God, sitting at God's side, has now become a man and is now being beaten up by other men, humiliated by them. They're spitting on him. They're gambling for his clothes. They're whipping him. He's bleeding all over the place, staggering, stumbling. And this guy is hanging on a tree and says, "Father, forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing." We suffer as a part of a redemption. And Peter says that we can count that joy. And James says you can consider it joy when we go through those kinds of trials. Why? Because Jesus suffered to be our Redeemer. He didn't need to suffer to be redeemed. He suffered to be our Redeemer. And so when you and I suffer, we can count that joy, that we get to be like him, that we get to share in those sufferings. And we can look at Jesus and we can at least know that I have not had to shed blood for the suffering that I have to endure. And I can look at confidence with Christ and know that he's gone before me and that he has paved the way and that he suffered so he could be my Redeemer.